Good afternoon everyone, I'm Dave and with me I have Kim Han, Ryan, Lai Ang and Sishi, and today we will be presenting to you on discharge. We will first be talking about performance, which is the most obvious means of discharging a contract, and it simply means parties performing their contractual obligations. When these obligations are performed, the contract comes to an end and is thus discharged. We see this in our everyday lives. When you board a bus and make payments, this forms a contract between you and a bus company as we discussed in Seminar 2. The bus company then transports you from one location to another, which is then performing their contractual obligations. After you disembark, the contract comes to an end and is thus discharged. This brings us to the definition of the precise performance rule, which states that parties must perform their obligations fully and precisely if a contract is to be discharged by performance. This rule has to be strictly abided by for anyone who wishes to do so. Let's look at the case of Remo and Company, where it was contracted that canned fruits be delivered in boxes of 30 cans. However, when the shipment arrived in boxes of 24 cans, it was held that the performance was less than full and precise, and the buyer was entitled to reject this shipment. In another case of Carter vs. Powell, Carter, who was a seaman, was contracted to receive his wages after he completes a voyage. However, he passed on 7 weeks into the journey, and his wife, his widow, was unable to receive any wages from Powell on the basis that Carter had not completed performance of his contractual obligations. However, there are some exceptions to this. This is to avoid unfairness when the precise performance rule is being strictly applied. The first being the de minimis rule, which states that if the deviation in performance is microscopic, then the contract is still deemed to have been performed fully and precisely. In our first case of Arcos Limited, the appellant contracted to sell wooden staves to English buyers for making of cement barrels. The sellers then declared most of their wooden staves to have a thickness of ½ inches. However, when the shipment arrived, the buyers realized and found that most of these wooden staves had a thickness of 9/16 inches instead. This led to them rejecting the shipment on the basis that the staves did not correspond with the goods description. His Lordship then stated that if the written contract specifies conditions of weight or measurement, then these conditions must be complied with. In our second case of Shipton and Company, the consignment of wheat was 55 pounds above the agreed, or rather the contracted quantity of 4,950 tons. However, it was still held that the sellers had duly performed their contractual obligations, as number 1, the seller did not claim the excess, and number 2, the value of excess was so minute compared to that of the bulk. From this, we can see that if the deviation in performance is microscopic, as in Shipton and Company's case, then the contract can be discharged. However, if the deviation in performance is not microscopic, as in Arcos' case, then the contract cannot be discharged. Another exception would be in the event of divisible contracts. In some circumstances, the contract may be seen to comprise several independent obligations, which may then be deemed as severable subcontracts. This allows these subcontracts to be discharged separately without the full and precise performance of the contract as a whole. If we look at an example, modern employment contracts, they too are divisible contracts. They have obligations severable on a weekly or on a monthly basis, which allows employees to get paid periodically. This allows us to avoid the situation we saw in Carter vs. Powell, where Carter's wife was unable to claim any partial wages for her husband as he passed away midway during the voyage. For exceptions under divisible contracts, it's important for parties to note that the idea of severability refers to obligations under the contract and not the contract itself. In the case of Maplethorpe Co. Limited, His Lordship stated that a contract for the sale of goods by installments is a single contract, not a complex of as many contracts as there are installments under it. So Kim Han, what are some other exceptions?
Alright, thank you, Dave. Now we move on to look at the third exceptions to a general rule of full and precise performance rules, substantial performance. So according to this principle, the promisor has substantially performed its obligations under a contract and can claim the agreed amount less than the amount necessary to make goods of the defects. However, we should always take note of two cautionary remarks when applying the principle of substantial performance. First, it can only be adopted provided the contract is divisible, or if the payment is not especially conditioned upon the full performance of the contract. If not, substantial performance cannot be argued. We'll first examine the case of Hoeing versus EZ, 1952, when the contract was divisible, and Hoeing, the flag decorators, could claim payments due to his substantial performance, less any cost of remedying the defects. The second cautionary remarks is to determine what is exactly amount to substantial performance. The degree of the completion required to satisfy the substantial performance is dependent on the facts of each case. For this, we'll examine the case of Boston versus Mahadeva, 1972, where Mahadeva engaged Boston to install central heating systems in his house for a lump sum of £560. However, after completion of the work, Mahadeva has discovered that the defects in it, and in order to remedy the defects, it will cost her £174, which is a proportion of the contract price. It was then held that by nature of the defects and the cost of the rectifications, that the contract has not been substantially performed and Boston was unable to recover the £560. Next, we will look at the fourth exceptions to the general rule of full and precise performance rules, prevented performance. In the event where a promisor has performed part of his obligations but is prevented by the other parties from performing the rest of his obligations, the contract may be treated as discharged on the basis of prevented performance. In this case, the promisors may sue for a breach of contract and claim payments commensurate with the obligations performed on the basis of quantum merits. There is the reasonable sum of money to be paid for service provided or work done when the amount due is not specified in a legally enforceable contract. For this, we examine the case of Planchet versus Coburn, 1831, where Coburn abandoned the book writing project that he contracted Planchet to write, and Planchet could hence claim remunerations on quantum merit basis, since the contract was discharged by Coburn's actions in abandoning the project. Now, the fifth exception to the general rule of full and precise performance rule is acceptance of partial performance. This arises when the promisee, the party who engage another party for services or work done, voluntarily accept the partial performance of the promisor. If the promisee accepts such partial performance, then the promisor is entitled to reasonable remunerations on a quantum merit basis under the law of restitutions. However, we should note that the promisor may still be liable to the promisee in the claim of damages for having only performed part of the contract, and the promisee must be given the choice of accepting or rejecting the partially completed work. We refer to a case of Slumter versus Hatch in 1898, where Slumter agrees to construct a building on Hatch land for £565. Subsequently, he failed to complete his obligations and Hatch had to complete the rest of the work. Slumter then sued for the value of the work that he has performed. In this case, it was held that since the Hatch had no choice but to accept the partially completed building on his land, Slumter cannot claim on the basis of acceptance of partial performance. However, in the event that Hatch did have a clear choice of accepting or rejecting the partially completed work, then Slumter could have succeeded on the basis of acceptance of partial performance. Next, I'll pass the time on to Bobby, who will discuss on the concept of anticipatory breach.
Hello, this is Bobby and I'll be going through anticipatory breach. So, first of all, let us recap. What is a breach? It occurs when a party fails to perform his obligations under the contract. So if you look at the slide over here, we have the timeline of a contract. Starting from the left, it is the formation of contract. So let's say there is a discharge or breach before the time of performance. You have anticipatory discharge, where the promisor, by words or conduct, has clearly expressed his intention not to perform the obligation. Just a note, this is before the time of performance for the obligation. Hence, there might be a discharge due to anticipatory breach. However, at the time of performance itself, there will be an actual discharge. This is caused by promisor failing to perform obligations on the due date itself. Hence, at this point, there might be a discharge due to actual breach. Cases include the STX Mumbai 2015 and Tembusu Growth Fund Limited versus ACTA Tech Inc. and others 2017. Next up, we have repudiation. So, for an actual breach, you need to have a breach of condition, fundamental breach, or a breach of warranty to be a repudiation breach. For an anticipatory breach, you have something else where a party, by words or conduct, renounces all his obligations under the contract. We call this renunciation. Let us look at a case example. The STX Mumbai 2015. So, the defendant ship STX Mumbai was arrested by the plaintiff 2 days before a debt owed was due. The plaintiff argued that the insolvency of the parent company resulted in an anticipatory repudiatory breach. The Singapore High Court held that insolvency does not amount to an repudiatory breach. However, the Court of Appeal later disagreed. The insolvency, along with other factors, made the defendant unable to make timely payments. Doctrine of anticipatory breach applies to both executed and executory contract. In this case, there is an anticipatory breach by the plaintiff where, they predicted that the defendant might not be able to pay back. Important notes over here. Repudiation must be unequivocal. An honest misapprehension would not amount to repudiation if there is an underlying willingness to correct one's understanding and fulfill those obligations. There is one such case study on Mercy Steel and Iron Co. versus Naylor Benson and Co. 1884. Next up, we have claim for damages. So, even with this repudiatory breach, the contract is not automatically discharged. There is a right of election for the innocent party to decide whether they want to discharge the contract or affirm the contract and carry on. So if you look at the flow chart, there is an election. If you decide to affirm the contract remains on foot and both parties must continue to fulfill the obligation. The innocent party still retains the right to claim damages for the breaches. However, if you choose to discharge the contract, you are entitled to claim damages. Releases parties, and it also releases parties from obligations that are not yet fulfilled. When it comes to anticipatory breach, as the due date of the event has not happened, there is a slight risk. If you decide to affirm the contract and there is a frustrating event along the way, the contract will still be discharged by frustration. Hence, this is the risk that you take when you want to affirm the contract for anticipatory breach. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Now, I will be explaining the concept of frustration. What exactly is frustration? Frustration refers to the situation in which a supervening event occurs whereby neither party is responsible, rendering contractual obligations impossible, or radically changes the party's principal purpose for entering into the contract. There are a couple of circumstances in which the law deems a contract to have been frustrated. These are destruction of subject matter, personal incapacity, non-occurrence of event, and government intervention. Firstly, destruction of subject matter. This is one of the more straightforward examples of frustration. It is a situation whereby the subject matter of the contract is destroyed due to no fault of the parties. This can be seen in the case of Taylor v. Caldwell. Both parties entered into a contract of lease for a music hall. However, the hall was accidentally destroyed by a fire a day before the performance. Thus, the court held that the contract was discharged by frustration. Secondly, personal incapacity. A contract for personal services may be frustrated if the personal incapacity affects the performance of the contract in a fundamental way. This is shown in the case of Poussat v. Spires and Pont. Poussat, an opera singer, fell ill before her production. This caused her to be unable to perform. The court held that the contract was frustrated because of her illness. It is important to take note the difference between a contract for personal services and a contract for services. Contract for personal services is like the one mentioned earlier, where a personal incapacity affects the performance in a fundamental way. A contract for services, on the other hand, is one where the subject is the service provider. For example, when a student enters a university, there is a contract between him and the university for which the university provides educational services. The university does not provide personal services of particular lecturers. Thus, in the event that there is a change in lecturer, it does not affect the contract in a fundamental way, and thus, the contract is not frustrated. Thirdly, the non-occurrence of an event. This is when an event whose occurrence forms the underlying basis of a contract is cancelled or postponed due to no fault of the parties. In the case of Krell v. Henry, Henry contracted to rent a flat from Krell from the 26th to the 27th of June to view the coronation parade. Henry paid part rent, but the coronation was postponed to a later date. Krell sued for the balance of the rent. However, the court held that the contract was frustrated because the basis of the contract, the viewing of the coronation, did not occur during the time of rental. Thus, the purpose of renting the flat vanished. A contrasting case would be the Herne Bay Steamboat v. Hutton. Hutton chartered a boat from Herne Bay Steamboat for the 28th of June to take passengers to view the coronation naval review and tour the fleet. the coronation was postponed and the review cancelled. The court held that the contract was not frustrated as the viewing of the naval review was not the sole basis of the contract. Even though the review was cancelled, the passengers could still view the fleet. By comparing these two cases, we can see that ultimately the contract is only frustrated if the event which did not occur is considered to be one which both parties hold fundamental to the contract. Lastly, government interference. Most of the time, this comes in the form of unexpected government action or ruling which prevents the performance of a contract. This can be seen in the case of Metropolitan Water Board with Dick, Kerr and Co. Dick, Kerr and Co. was contracted by the Water Board to construct a reservoir. However, during the time of construction, the government halted work. Thus, the court concluded that the contract was frustrated and it was thus discharged. Now, I'll be handing my time over to Sishi, who will be talking about the effects of frustration and FCA.
Under the common law, frustration automatically discharges a contract and is effective immediately, requires no communication or advice from one party to the other. The effect of frustration on the parties' remedies is summarized by the phrase, "the losses lie where they fall," meaning that they must be borne by the party which suffers them. The Frustrated Contracts Act, FCA, alters this position, which will be explained further later in details. The overall effect of the common law and statutory provisions can be summarized as follows. Firstly, all future obligations of the party cease. Secondly, money paid prior to time of discharge is recoverable, following Section 2.2 of FCA. Thirdly, money payable ceases to be so payable, which follows Section 2.2 of FCA. In addition, expenses incurred prior to time of discharge can be recovered, following Section 2.3 of FCA. Last but not least, benefits conferred other than money prior to time of discharge can be compensated with an amount the court considers just, following Section 2.4 of FCA. It should be noted that, pursuant to Section 3.5 of FCA, the provisions of the legislation apply to all contracts other than a contract for the carriage of goods by sea, certain types of charter parties, a contract of insurance, a contract to which Section 7 of the Sale of Goods Act applies, and a contract for the sale of specific goods, where the contract's frustrated because the goods have perished. Next, the Frustrated Contracts Act, FCA, alters and adds to the common law position. The common law effect that all future obligations cease is untouched by the Act, but the Act does alter the remedies in three respects: payments, expenses, and benefits. Section 2.2 of FCA provides that all sums paid before the time of discharge are recoverable, while all sums payable at the time cease to be so payable. This is a reversal of the common law position. Of course, the amount recoverable cannot be more than the actual expenses. Section 2.3 of FCA provides that if a contracting party has, by reason of any act done by the other party in performance of the contract, obtained a valuable benefit before the time of discharge, the court may allow the other party to recover a sum which is appropriate in the circumstances, if it is considered just to do so. The court has to consider the effect, if any, that the frustrating event had on the benefit. Furthermore, Section 3.4 of FCA provides for several parts of a contract to be treated separately, so that parts of a contract may be frustrated, while other parts continue unaffected. When frustration does occur, the provisions of the FCA will apply. Essentially, this legislation attempts to restore the parties to their status quo before they enter into the contract. The Act also makes improvements over the previous common law position and facilitates a more equitable settlement of rights and remedies in the event of frustration. With this, I would like to end the presentation and move on to an A session. Thank you.